Now pause for a moment and look around. No, take a good look around at your children, the children around you. Think about your own life. Surely that must make you happy, maybe even proud to see your children do what they do. But that isn't the story of many African children. And if you can wrap your mind around it, about 305 million African children will be living in extreme poverty in the next 8 years, according to statistics. 98 million of our children now are out of school, according to the UNICEF. 13.5 million children are internally displaced, which means they don't live in their homes. So today on the program, we will consider the plight of some African children. I'm Keminni Amanor, and you're welcome to Village Square Africa. Welcome back to the program. Now, African children, like every child in the world, are also the future of our continent. They hold solutions to problems, keys to locked doors, and are the hope we all cherish, guide and guards us people. Children in Africa are talented, they are smart and sound, and have often been victims of persecution, early marriages, and recruitment into rebel groups. More than ever, there is a great need for every African government to protect and promote the future of this continent. On the program today, we'll get to the progress the continent has made in protecting its children and the practices that continue to pose risks to the African child. And with me to discuss this are Betty Abah. She's Executive Director at the Center for Children's Health Education, Orientation and Protection. She's joining us from Nigeria. We also have Thando Gumede. She's founder of M-TETO search engine, and she's joining us from Gauteng, South Africa. And then last but not least is Susan Kanga. She's a business development specialist. She's also joining us from Kisumu, Kenya. Ladies, you're welcome to the square. Now, once upon a time, we all were children, weren't we? So let me put you on the spot. Growing up, what would you say, and Thando, I'll start with you. Growing up, what would you say your worldview of how protected you were was?
Well, I think I come from quite an interesting society being a South African. I was born during the time of transition in our country. And as you know, South Africa is a country that has suffered from colonial rule, as well as post-colonial rule in the form of apartheid. And the interesting thing about being someone my age is that we've seen, we've been able to witness some of the elements of our transition as we struggle to become a democracy. But I think the reality is that we haven't been safe for a very long time. And it's difficult sometimes to think about whether these are novelties in terms of the violence we're experiencing, or whether what we're experiencing is something that has been here for a very long time, that has been lingering, but has finally come to the surface because we are a democratic society where we are now enabled to be able to voice our opinions, our perceptions, and our experiences. Growing up, the idea of gender-based violence was slowly creeping up to become quite a critical situation in our society. And, interestingly enough, today is the second presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. We've gone from kind of tiptoeing around issues of safety and of gender-based violence in our society to it being to such an extent that it's actually a national crisis. But my argument is that this is not something new, and it's something that we very definitely inherited from colonial rule.
Very well. I'll go to Kenya now. And Susan, you're joining us from Kisumu. Tell us about what it is like for children in Kisumu, and feel free, of course, to share your own experience with us.
Thank you. I would start by saying that personally, growing up from childhood, of course, was not so much easy because I grew up in a rural area. I was born and raised in the rural parts of Kisumu. And for a girl, it was not that much easy because of the opportunities that missed out a girl growing up in rural areas. One of them that being that there was much protectiveness of the girl child, and that again there were no opportunities for discussions around issues around the girl child, general development of the girl child, and also even the opportunity to discuss issues around your personal growth and all that. But again, going by what happens in the society, it's not different from any other country. And the same things that we face across Kenya, be it Kisumu, be it Mombasa, whichever areas are the same. Because the girl child or the women are going through gender-based violence in some areas. And this is as a result of issues around lack of knowledge about the rights that we have as women. But if you look at the Kenyan constitution, we have it clearly under chapter 6 of the constitution. It talks about the rights, the rights to even the human rights. And of course, we have grown from where people did not know their rights, and we are now trying to create awareness. So we are trying to create a knowledge on our rights. And of course, it's not that of full knowledge to so many people. And gender-based violence still exists, but it's a struggle that we still have as a country. Yeah.
Now, Betty, what would you say the situation was like in Nigeria? Betty, I believe you have muted yourself, so if you could unmute, would hear you better.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So I would say that it's the situation of children, state of children in Nigeria is not radically different from what we've heard from the other speakers. Children in Nigeria, just as women, have always been the face of poverty, the face of oppression, the face of dehumanization. So growing up in very in what we call the backwaters of Nigeria, in Benue, children have always been the ones running errands. Children have always remained the figure of the oppressed. And even now, nothing has radically changed in the ways in which we view children and the rights of children. It's so saddening because in places like UK, when you juxtapose the situation of children in Nigeria, in Africa, and what obtains in the developed world, I always use the example of the UK. The situation is radically different because in those countries, the welfare, the well-being of children are prioritized, and the state of a child can cost the prime minister his job. The publicized state of child poverty in a place in England can cost the MP his or her job, but that doesn't seem to be what obtains here. And it's the more reason why conversations like these are extremely important for us to view the state of children and what can be done. We have all kinds of laws on the rights of the Nigerian child, laws about child protection and all of that. Most times those laws are not enforced. Most times the people, especially in the underserved communities are not aware and of their rights. And some of them do violate the rights of their own children and wards because they are not aware. So I think we can do much more in ensuring that we prioritize the rights of children in Nigeria.
So let's talk about those obstacles that are making it difficult for children to assess their rights. And Thando, I'll bring you in at this point. From from the South African perspective, what would you say are the obstacles that exist?
Well, I'm glad you've asked me that question. I actually think that one of the key obstacles is that we don't even know what gender-based violence is and what the various manifestations of gender-based violence actually are. Gender-based violence is the unfair discrimination of a human being or a group of individuals based purely on the premise of their sex, their gender, and their sexual orientation. And what this does is that it creates arbitrary biases, prejudices, privileges that benefit boys, men, heterosexual people, able-bodied persons, especially white and wealthy people. And, what happens is that if you don't present in society at large as a superior a human being, that obviously being white, male, able-bodied, then you are oppressed, you are subjugated, and in some instances you're even killed. And child marriage is just one of the manifestations of gender-based violence that people absolutely don't understand. In South Africa, just from a South African perspective, we don't necessarily call it child marriage, we call it uktwala. So in South Africa, we have this distorted ideologies and ideas around what is cultural, what is custom, what is, what is a colonial myth. So we have this practice in South Africa called uktwala, where sometimes old men will negotiate with even the family. The family will agree to their child being taken by a man in their 40s, their 13-year-old being taken by a grown man in their 40s or their 50s. And essentially, if there's no consent, then of course that is rape. And of course, a child that is 13 or 14 years old can't consent in any case, regardless of whether they wanted to participate or not. And so I think for me, as I'm here at the summit engaging with ministers and the president and various leaders in various parts of society, I find that the biggest issue and the biggest crisis that we're dealing with is that people don't even know what gender-based violence is. And so they don't even have the foundation to begin having the critical, crucial discussions to ask and to answer the crucial and critical questions. For instance, in South Africa, as a result of how uneducated we are, as one of the other panelists had said, there was a study that was done in 2017 that found that between the ages of 12 and 17, there are 91,000 girls that are either married, divorced, separated, or living with a partner in the country. And that's according to our national statistics, South Africa. So I think, and even that data isn't disaggregated. We don't know the details of that data. We don't know what interventions have been rolled out, to what extent has there been an assessment of the impact for interventions to try and prevent or respond to effectively what is rape, what has become some kind of cultural rape. So between the lack of education and understanding of violence and how it manifests itself, to there not being any effort to use evidence-based initiatives to prevent and to respond, to not even gathering the appropriate data and monitoring and evaluating the impact of interventions being rolled out on the ground. I'd say those are the key priority things that we really need to consider going forward.
Right. Betty, what would you say are some of the key things that you would consider obstacles to the welfare of the African child? in Nigeria, maybe?
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I would like to speak from the Nigerian experience. Rape and gender-based violence, for instance, one of the biggest obstacles we've had is the stigmatization of rape survivors. And that alone, that culture of silence, that attitude which perpetuates the culture of silence, ensures that sexual violence against children, for instance, continues unabated. When parents, when guardians are not sensitized to speak up, you discover that the perpetrators will always go ahead to continue to perpetuate the violence from one child to the other. So the culture of silence is a major one. People need to speak up, and then the law enforcement agencies really need to sit up and be seen as a workable system. Because working with marginalized communities, having to work on sexual violence, child sexual abuse over the years, one of the biggest obstacles we've seen are the laxity and the compromised state of the Nigerian law enforcement agencies, where law enforcement officers sometimes tend to side with the perpetrators because they have a higher financial power, which should not be, because the law enforcement agencies should side with the most vulnerable in the society. So if we are able to deal with the culture of silence in terms of the rape and the need to speak up, if we are able to deal with the corruption in the law enforcement agencies, we believe that a lot will change. Because as long as people have the higher financial power, that they can buy their way through, that they can silence their victims or survivors, so to say, then we're not going to make any headway in dealing with sexual violence, especially against children and against the most vulnerable in the society. So those are major things. And then, of course, the need for the lawmakers, policymakers to step down the laws to the most vulnerable, because when you talk in terms of child abuse, in terms of gender-based violence, sexual violence in particular, it's mostly in the rural areas, it's more prevalent in the marginalized communities, the urban slums, where a lot of the people are ignorant, are uneducated. And so when policymakers make laws, and then they continue to be detached from the populace, the demography that are most likely to be affected, then it's not going to work. People have to know what the laws are about. People have to know their rights. People have to know where to report when they think their rights are being violated. We have, for instance, in some of the communities where we work in Lagos, child marriages going on unabated, female genital mutilation going on unabated, because people come around with their cultures and they're not aware that there are even laws that criminalizes those cultures. And so the government has to be on the same.
Betty, we'll come to what the government needs to do. I apologize, Betty. We'll come to what the government needs to do in order to make our communities fit for our children, particularly girl children. But I'll take the conversation to Susan now. Susan, you've heard from your co-panelists tonight about, the things that are fueling the poor situation of the African child in their communities. What would you say about Kenya?
I think in Kenya, it's not different from what is happening in Nigeria or South Africa. But what I would say is that, as my counterpart from South Africa said, we still do not understand what gender-based violence is, even as an adult, because for us to build our children's capacity to be able to understand that this is gender-based violence, and this is what I need to take, or the precautions I need to take, or this is what I need to report in case this happens, it starts with us. Because even at the workplace, there's gender-based violence, but we rarely, as women, report those cases. And it's even with the leads that gender-based violence happens, and they're quiet about it. So until we understand what gender-based violence is, then I think we'll be in a better place to address the issues around gender-based violence. Now, in the rural areas, I would say that our children, the girl child is more affected in the rural areas. Why? Because one is the issues around poverty. The poverty levels in the rural areas are high. And because somebody is less privileged to the fact that he cannot negotiate or he cannot fight for the rights of their girl, then they'll succumb to what they are provided for. And my colleague talked about issues around corruptions that affect our affect the address on issues around gender-based violence. So the perpetrators, end up being free because one, they're able to negotiate, and they negotiate with money, or they negotiate through their people who the haves who negotiate with the poor, and it's like in exchange of the girl child rights. And this thing happens, and I'll tell you, I've had experiences in cases that have come to me of a girl raped, probably by even a teacher, and it ends up nowhere because the cases are not addressed. Or a girl is raped and is taken to hospital, but because they cannot afford the cost of treatment or tests, then it ends nowhere. Mm-hmm. Or they cannot afford the cost of even getting a police abstract or to take the case forward. Or right. They cannot file or pay for the case, or they file a fee for the case to go forward. So these things, we are yet there in terms of gender-based violence. It starts with us as the adults to understand what gender-based violence is before even we educate our children or our girls.
Now, Thando, I know that your company has created an app that makes it easy for people to report on issues of gender-based violence. Now, tell us a bit about this app and how it's helping people.
Okay, thank you so much. So, as mentioned earlier, I'm Advocate Thando Gumede. I'm a lawyer, and I'm also a social entrepreneur from South Africa. And we are busy developing a technology called M-TETO search engine. And M-TETO search engine is a piece of technology in the form of a mobile app that leverages on law, artificial intelligence, and gamification to try and to prevent and adequately respond to incidences of school-related gender-based violence, which occur in and outside of the educational contexts. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to bridge the gap between young people and especially children, as well as the justice ecosystem. So we essentially have got a search engine that provides access to knowledge, educational materials such as games, videos, lectures, webinars, books. All of it, of course, this is entirely free. And then also access to very key service providers within the justice ecosystem. And with this also, we're able to aggregate very key and crucial disaggregated data that can help either service providers or development agencies, governments, institutions, and what have you that have got a mandate or an obligation or a desire to try and empower children or to help to break the cycle of gender-based violence, for children and for young people in the world. And currently partnered with the Gauteng government, provincial government, of community safety. And we're working together in the province to deal with issues of gender-based violence and femicide, and also partnered nationally with the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. And M-TETO has won about 7 international and local awards. We've traveled the world and had been able to present at the Royal Academy of Engineering, considered one of the top innovations and innovators across the African continent. And we're currently being funded by the Mozilla Foundation that specializes in high impact technology that leverage on artificial intelligence and the use of safe use of data.
Very well. Now,
I just want to quickly agree with my panelists to say the accessibility of law and justice, especially for young people and children, is quite appalling. And it's one of the reasons why here in South Africa, I'm really calling for there to be a seventh pillar in our national strategic plan on gender-based violence and femicide. It is specifically for children because their needs are very much peculiar to those of adults. And children's voices are completely muted, unheard, and are not even considered in policy development and in consultations and making key critical decisions about how our countries, our economies, and our justice systems move forward.
Indeed. I'm afraid, ladies, would have to leave our conversation here for now, but I do appreciate your time with us here on the square. Thank you so much. Now, Village Square Africa continues in a moment. Stay with us. Now, with some of the most brilliant humans scattered across the world, there's a touch of Africans everywhere on the globe. The continent cannot afford to abandon its future or fail to cater for its brightest and most beautiful resources. With many families struggling to feed and survive, there's an urgent necessity of helping more African families educate their children who are capable of raising their families to greater positions. We're still discussing the rise of an African child, and joining me now on the program are Kola Olatosimi, who is the coordinator, Child and Youth Protection Foundation in Nigeria. We also have Ntlotleng Mabena, a gender-based violence technical specialist with NACOSA from South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Now, first I want to start with you, Kola. What are the rights of the African child that are gravely under-asserted at the moment?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. There are fundamental rights of the African child, and one of them is the right to survive, as enshrined in the African Charter on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child. Now we have the right for survival, we have the right to development, we have the right to participation, and we also have the right to development. And these rights, if you begin to look at them as enshrined in the African Charter on the Right of the Welfare of the Child and also on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, have given these rights to all African children. And we believe that African children are supposed to be enjoying this right, but that is not the case in the continent.
I'll come to you now, Ntlotleng. Tell us, you are a GBV specialist. Tell us how GBV affects, the African child.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think we always need to remember that when we're talking about violence against children, we're talking about a concept that is completely embraced and under the umbrella term of gender-based violence, because we do know it is about power dynamics, masculinity, femininity, that also put children as vulnerable people to facing gender-based violence in their different settings. Children experience a variety of violence that is perpetrated by family members, by the community, by society, by even the systems that are supposed to be there to protect the children against all forms of violence. And remember, when we're talking about violence against children, we are not only talking about issues of physical violence or even sexual violence, but we are talking about the whole spectrum of violence that children encounter, from emotional abuse, from neglect, and the list goes on.
And so let's talk about the mental health of the African child. How seriously have we taken that?
So I wanted to say at the beginning of the conversation that we have to always remember that children also have agency. Children have lived experiences, and it would be good for me in future to always have the voice of the child when we are having such conversations as we are having now. I'm literally talking from a perspective of a healthcare provider, a human rights defender, sexual reproductive health and rights advocate. But I'm no way talking on behalf of children, because they do have their own agency and lived experiences. When we talk about mental health issues, again, highlights the fact that we do not engage children enough. We don't listen to the voice of the child enough, so that all programs and interventions that we are offering to protect children are primarily putting the mental health of these children at center of everything that we do. We talk about teenage pregnancies, which I usually term as childhood pregnancies, because they're children. What are we doing as society, as health systems, as social development agencies, child protection units? What are we doing to provide the necessary psychosocial support to these young people who fall pregnant, usually at the prey of adult men? What are we doing to support these young people and their mental health journey, and providing them proper psychosocial support so that they are more empowered, more ready to be able to deal with whatever circumstances that they are facing? Our interventions are usually just interventions that look at, if it's teenage pregnancy, for instance, childhood pregnancy, we just look at natal care and delivery services, but we often don't put mental health of these children at the center of our interventions and services that we provide.
Right. I want us to look at some of the factors that fuel poor welfare of children on the continent. Early on the program, we've talked about poverty, the lack of knowledge, and a few others. But I want us to focus on two things. First, the traditions of people around the continent. Kola, from your experience, what role would you say traditions have played over the years in the welfare of the African child?
I think tradition and culture have been one of the hindrances in supporting child protection in the continent, because most of the African culture believe that children must be seen and not heard. And so the moment you are saying that children need to participate in their own welfare, people begin to say that you're going away from culture. Our culture and our tradition have also have what we call harmful traditional practices that have been passed down over the course of the years in Africa, and people have believed that this is our ways. And a lot of people in Africa still believe that the right of children is a westernized form of colonization. I don't really, I tend not to agree with this, but that is the perception of a lot of people. Presently, I'm in Yola, we're talking about mainstreaming gender mainstreaming in education, and people are still saying, we still have some people in some parts of this state that still believe that the girl child should not be in school. So culture, harmful traditional practices in our culture is still an impediment into the protection of the rights of children and the welfare of children in our continent. But let me to say here this evening that there are some part of our culture that so much believe in the protection of children, but we have tends to not promote those positive tradition and culture in the African continent, and many a times we'll just portray the negative and the harmful culture in Africa, and these are affecting us in providing for the rights of our children, number one, and two, still believe that child participation, child's right is a Western ideology that do not have a place in Africa.
We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit, but let's send the same question to Mabena. Mabena, share with us how traditions and customs affect the welfare of children in South Africa.
Thank you. So my colleague really just laid the foundation quite succinctly, and we have similar experiences where harmful cultural practices really play a significant role in perpetuating violence against children. He spoke about the concept of being raised in a way where children must be seen and not heard, and that practice, that cultural practice, has really come all this way with us, where even now when children disclose certain things at a family level, they are not necessarily taken seriously, or they are told to retract their stories because the person they are accusing is a breadwinner. So we've got a lot of harmful cultural practices that, even if they don't directly impact on violence, but mostly they are violence that we see amongst children and young people. I mean, there's also a whole issue about virginity testing, where it's a cultural practice that is practiced by a very huge population in South African settings. Yet we do not interrogate enough the pervasive nature of continuing with certain practices, where children are being checked to see whether they are sexually active or not. And we are talking here from a basis where studies have actually shown that there are so many children who have experienced sexual violence as children. I think I can't talk of the stats from the top of my head right now, but it's something like 1 in 3 children have experienced some form of sexual violence.
Right.
So if we are promoting virginity testing and all of that, what are we doing to the mental health of those children who were sexually violated as children? Because now they are being stigmatized even further by this practice that we are practicing because we want to protect the children.
Now,
so, yeah.
A lot of money or funding has been poured into making Africa better for children, making the life of the African child better. And I'll come to you, Kola, with this. Tell us how or why you think that in spite of all that funding, we still have what we see here on the continent. Why don't they match?
Thank you very much. UNICEF will tell you how much you have spent in the continent to protect children. UNFPA, UN Women will tell you how much you have spent to protect children. But the problem is when you do not take into consideration localizing intervention and ensuring that interventions by all donor agencies are sustained and adapted by the people. We keep saying that we're just spending so much money and we're not getting the impact. Because the African child needs to be protected and cared for within the African system that have been restructured and transformed. And so we need to start doing funding that are gender child transformative approaches, and collectively communities, countries in Africa must begin to own child protection. And so when funders are coming and they are coming with an idea that is developed outside of Africa, and then you have so much fund for it, and you implement over a course of 2 years or 3 years, you'll find out that after the expiration of the project, you leave. And so the community go back to the status quo of what they used to do before. But if you are funding and building capacities of local stakeholders to take ownership of child protection in their communities, if you're developing the capacity of local stakeholders to begin to initiate internally interventions that protect children, then we can start seeing sustainable approaches. But right now, we spend so much money is not sustainable because they are not from within. They are not. They are explicit and not explicit, and that's why we're still seeing these gaps in pursuing the rights of children in Africa. But when we begin to build capacities of CSOs, LBOs in Africa, to begin to come up with programs and intervention that are community-driven, and it must start from the aspect of planning to intervention. Then we begin to see the changes that we're looking for.
Mabena, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'm sorry, the connectivity went a little bit, so I picked up certain components of the question. I hope I will be responding to what you were asking. I think one of the biggest challenges working with donor funding is that a lot of times the agenda for programming, for interventions that we need to put in place is often coming with the money that is coming to provide whatever services. So as Africans, we have not been loud enough in setting our own agendas that are context specific, that are people specific in our settings. We need to really rethink how we engage with donors, with funders, but we also need to rethink and look at how we engage with our governments.
Right.
Because ultimately we need our governments to be the ones who are funding these local organizations at community level to put in place whatever programs that they see because of their context is needed in those areas. So we really need to start shifting the conversation a little bit to say, we are able to set our own agendas as Africans. We know our problems, we live them every day. And donor funding money should take this into consideration and not dictate to us what we need to do. But in the same breath, we need to make sure that we are holding our governments accountable so that they can fund these programs, which is their responsibility, since they've also ratified a lot of instruments, international instruments.
We have about 2 minutes to go. Now, both of you tell us, what would be your advice to African leaders at all levels, at the home, at the community level, at the local government level, even at the national level, on how to make the continent or their small spaces fit for the African child? Kola.
Yeah, increase, listen more to children. They have the solution to whatever they're passing through. And governments in the continent must take ownership of the welfare and the care of children. We must spend, government in Africa must put their money where their mouth is when it comes to child protection. We must spend our own money, we must develop our own agenda, and then intervention must be community driven.
Mabena.
Yes. So I think, as I started, I really think that it's time for us to really engage young people and children. Give them space, give them the platform to talk, from family level to community level to, all these different structures. We really need to give the girl child a platform to be able to speak their lived experiences. And this is also how, as adults, we will begin to learn and unlearn some of these harmful traditional practices, harmful cultural practices, hearing the voices of children, but also hearing where their needs are, because we are often not responding to their needs, but we are responding to what we think is their needs. So yeah, we need to give more space for children and young people to talk.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your time here on the square. And we also thank you for your insights. Hopefully, we would raise the issue of the girl child in the future, and it will all be good things. Thank you so much. Well, thank you too at home for joining us today for today's episode of Village Square Africa. I am Keminni Amanor. I'll see you same time tomorrow. Good night.